In my last clip, I was lauding the play of Fabiano Caruana, who was leading FIDE Grand Prix tournament with 4.5 out of 6. And this clip is really a postscript to that. In round 7, he was playing against the back marker in the tournament, Dmitry Andreikin, up to this game not having a good time, really out of form. And clearly Caruana here, again with the black pieces, decided to try and mix things up. Instead of playing his standard e5, he decided to play something a little bit offbeat, the Scandinavian, and not even one of the main lines with Queen a5, but he played Queen d6. That's a speciality of Sergei Tviakov. It's a tricky little system, but as I said, very offbeat. And clearly Caruana is trying to somehow unsettle Andreikin, play something that's unfamiliar. He's trying to do a Carlsen, basically. But things didn't go terribly well. Caruana found himself under pressure. Andreikin played very well. It was a very complicated game. And, well, we rejoined the game after 32 moves. Andreikin has just played his knight into e5. It protects this far advanced pass pawn on d7. Now, Caruana has been struggling with this d pawn for many moves and found himself under intense pressure. But around about this stage, he's actually starting to find his feet. He's managed to post this knight on d5, shutting out white's pieces on the d file. And with this next move, he manages to attack the knight. So the knight moved away, and that means finally Caruana has been able to get rid of this thorn in his side, or not even in his side, in the centre of the board, this d pawn. But you can see that now the knight has come to b4, threatening to take on d5. Andreikin is trying to unleash the full force of his queen and rooks into Caruana's position. Caruana, in fact, is probably okay here, but in trying to alleviate this pressure, he's run very short of time, and so by this stage Caruana was down to under a minute to get to move 40. And this is an extremely difficult position to play for black. Caruana played Queen a7, wanting to swap off queens to take some of the pressure off his position. But in fact, he missed a very good move here. He could have played Rook a4. Now, I certainly don't blame him for missing this move. It's very difficult to appreciate why this is such a strong move. But let's see. Well, let's play the obvious continuation. Let's exchange on d5. So it looks as though the queen and rook very nicely placed. The black queen is attacked. And with this pawn on f6, it means that black's king is rather exposed. But in fact, black is fine here. It's surprising that, well, these queen and rooks at the side of the board can actually match white's centralised forces. It's all down to specific tactics. Well, first of all, you can see there's a threat to play Rook a1. Well, let's play an obvious move. Let's just move the queen up. But then comes a check. And then this is the problem. This pawn is on prise, and suddenly black has a very dangerous counterattack. In fact, white can survive this and get a draw by perpetual check. I think that's fairly obvious. What else? Well, Queen d4 is another obvious try, and in this way to make sure that the f-pawn can't be taken after the check. But here actually black is more than fine in this endgame with pressure on this pawn, so that's also fine. I mean, there are other variations here, but after Rook a4, but well, let's just show you. I'll show you one more. g4 is an interesting move. White has been gunning to play this move for some time to somehow get at this bishop. But here, again, queen a7 is an excellent move, threatening rook a1. And when the queen moves up, here's the trick. And it's quite possible that Caruana missed this idea. You can sacrifice the exchange, and now, still looks like black is in trouble, but excellent move, bishop d3. And you can see that the queen on a7 hits the rook here. Black is fine. So rook a4 would have been a very powerful move, but you know, with just seconds on the clock, very difficult to see. The real problem was that Caruana had spent too much time earlier trying to get out of a difficult position. Instead he played queen a7. Let me show you what happened in the game. Again, this move g4 forces the bishop in here, and now white is able to win a pawn. So very simple methods. Okay, this check here, and queen takes b2. If knight takes b4, then, well, white breaks through easily. So queen takes b2, and now white breaks through. Again, it's this problem with the pawn on f6, which means that black is exposed on the 7th rank. So black has to take a timeout to defend with rook a7, but white simply picks up a pawn. So white is a pawn up for nothing. Now, sometimes in these heavy piece endings, the defender has reasonable chances, but again, it's the problem that black has to defend his king and defend against the advance of the c-pawn. White is absolutely perfectly placed here with these centralized queen and rook. And Andreikin's technique was perfect, actually. Let's see how he did it. First of all, he tied black down to defending the pawn on f6. Queen d4, beautiful centralization. You can see that when white is centralized like this, then it not only attacks black, but also helps to protect his own king. And in fact, the pawn on g4 is very well placed to cramp black's pawns here. So white is perfectly placed. So a check from Caruana. Good move, king h2. The king is completely safe. So now black has to defend against queen takes pawn. So rook f7. And now with black tied down on the king side, the way is clear for the c-pawn to advance very smoothly up the board. And really, black can do nothing. Well, let's just see what happens if black waits. The pawn advances again. Okay, queen here. Queen d5. So slowly we can just shepherd the pawn down the board. And, well, queen c7, that's a pin. We'll get out of the pin. And on the next turn, there's nothing to stop rook d7. And, well, with threats against the king, and the pawn is going to go through. So completely winning for white. Nice technique from Andreikin. So in this position, Caruana, as a last desperate shot, traded queens. But again, white's pieces are perfectly placed. This rook is wonderfully placed, hitting the pawns, controlling black's king, and able to support the pawn. First of all, there's a threat here, so that was protected. If the rook comes across, well, you can see c6 threatening this, king here, and king f3, and yeah, I mean, what a position for white. Black can do absolutely nothing here, supporting the pawn. So, rook f4 played, and good technique from Andreikin. Rook e6. If pawn number 2 is taken, it's all over, so black has to defend this. And now, actually, we can force the rook out of the way, or Andreikin forced the rook out of the way with f3. Let me just take you through the final moves of this game. So, second pawn drops, and now, excellent move, rook e2. So, Andreikin wants to bring the rook behind the pawn to force, to force it through. Well, there's a little bit of shuffling, but white gets there. And it doesn't matter about these pawns at all. The important thing is the rook is behind the passed pawn. Let's just see how this worked. If this pawn is taken, then actually the c-pawn rolls through. So, and Caruana had to hurry back with the rook, but this is a typical rook and pawn endgame, completely winning for white. So first of all, the rook prevents any nasty counterplay. And then the king advances. Well, I mean, this kingside pawn moves, they make no difference. The important thing is that white brings the king up and is ready to hit the rook. And of course, the king and pawn ending is winning. I mean, these were the last moves, and here Caruana resigned. Let's just see what would happen. I mean, obviously, if black waits, then the king comes in and that wins. And if black goes in for the king and pawn endgame, crucially, white wins the opposition here. Let's just see. You can force the black king away very simply like this. This is absolutely typical. And wins the g-pawn, and that's the end of the game. So there we go. Caruana tried to do a Carlsen in round 7, but I'm afraid failed. I don't blame him, because tempting to try to upset a player in the tournament who's doing badly, but I'm afraid Caruana's good luck ran out in round 7. However, he still shares the lead. He has 4.5. But he was joined by Gelfand also on 4.5. He drew with Kazimjanov. So the players are bunching in the tournament. Still a long way to go.